Please welcome Andrew Lebowitz for his session on practicing a creative mind, tools, skills, and methods. Andrew is a graphic designer, brand strategist, and innovation consultant turned EMT. He uses his own creativity to help those in their moments of greatest need. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Laura. I think I'm sharing my screen. Am I sharing my screen?
You are not yet sharing your screen.
No.
There we go.
Sweet. All right. I am going to absolutely breeze through perhaps a dense amount of information in a short amount of time. I want to give you a little bit of science, mindsets, and methods behind what I have learned around the practice of creativity over my 15 years. So we'll dive in. So today we're going to cover, like I mentioned, science. And I am not a scientist, but, I do a little bit of reading and research in my spare time. So we'll cover a little bit of the science, how the brain works, some mindsets that you can deploy and employ, and some frameworks that you can use. And then if we have time, hopefully some reflections on the dump that I just gave to you all. So this is me. I'm a creativity nerd, not a creative nerd, although I am creative, but I am most interested in how creativity works in the brain. This all stemmed from a moment of burnout when I was a designer, and I realized I was still able to produce high quality creative solutions to things. And I would sit there some days and I would be like, I don't even understand where this creative solution is coming from. And I started to realize that it comes from my process. It comes from years of practice. So I started really diving into how does creativity work. I've got 15 years, as Nora said, as a graphic designer, brand strategist, design thinking facilitator, design educator, design coach, and now I'm an EMT and finding all the ways that creativity plays into emergency medicine. So now for the science. I'm going to talk to you about two modes, network modes in your brain, and then I'm going to talk to you about how those two network modes come together to create something called flow state. So we're going to cover the default mode network a little bit, and then we're going to cover the executive control network a little bit, and then how all of that comes together to create a frame of mind based on what happens in your head. So first is the default mode network, and it is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. This is the default mode of your brain, i.e. your background brain. This is the network of neurons in your brain that fire when you are daydreaming, when you are introspecting, when you are applying what I will call unfocused attention, right? So, when you're driving and your mind starts drifting, but you're still able to drive your car, that mental process that's happening, that's your default mode network. The executive control network is what I'll call your boss brain, or i.e. the get shit done brain. This is your task-oriented, problem-solving, focused attention. This is where your brain, you are very intentional about what you are delegating your attention to, which fires a slightly different network of neurons in your brain, requires slightly different mental processes, and is good for different things. So we'll get into kind of what the default mode is good for, what the executive control network is good for, but probably based on the previous conversations, you're starting to get a sense of what mode you want to be in when you're ideating and what mode you want to be in when you're kind of trying to nail down that solution. So these two things, the executive control network and the default mode network, combine in a very interesting way to create something called the flow state. You can call it Zen, you can call it mindfulness, you can call it being in the moment. This flow state is something that happens when we are simultaneously relaxed but engaged. We don't have to necessarily think about what we're doing. We're able to just do whatever it is we're trying to do. It is in this state where we have sort of a relaxed, focused, locked in kind of mental state, right? We tend to lose track of our time. We tend to lose track of surroundings, and there's nothing but what we're doing in that moment. If you're into gardening, if you're into sculpting, if you're really into spreadsheets, maybe you find yourself kind of losing time and focus of everything else around you. If you play sports, if you played sports in high school or anything like that, you might have found yourself in these places where it's just you, your body, and whatever activity that you're engaging in. So for our purposes, we're going to define creativity or the creative mind as a combination of relaxed focus plus applied non-effort. These terms make absolutely no sense, but that's kind of the point, because creativity is in many ways a contradiction in terms of how your brain works. So you want to be focused on the task at hand, but if you're too focused on the task at hand, you can become locked into a singular solution. If you're applying effort towards something, you can become so intentional about what you're making, and you can start to lose opportunities around how to improve that or how to iterate that, or whether or not what you're making is even the right thing. So to sum the science section up, the creative mind, creativity, is a combination of neural processes applied in particular ways at particular times. And it is possible to tap into the different modes if you know how. We talked a little bit about improv today. We talked a little bit about empathy today. You know, there's a lot of talk around collaboration. You can use the structure of the design process to intentionally create spaces to engage your mind in particular ways that allow for different types of thought. I think Amy's example of the worst idea possible is a great example of kind of how to tap into this, what I'll call later the emergent mode. But we'll get there for a second. I'm jumping ahead of myself. But lucky for you, we're going to talk about different mental models, different mindsets that can allow you to tap into both the default mode network, the executive mode network, executive control network, and ideally push you towards this idea of flow state where you are engaged in the task at hand and able to really just kind of dive into the moment and not be self-conscious. So now, mindsets. You're probably already familiar with divergent and convergent mindsets. I'll cover those, but the ones that I think might be new to some of you, hopefully new, are analogous or lateral mindsets and emergent mindsets. So we'll get into what these are, and then I have little examples. So get out a piece of paper and a pen. I'm going to give you all a couple minutes on each slide to just kind of start to practice what a divergent mindset feels like, what a convergent mindset feels like, what an analogous and lateral mindset feels like, and what an emergent mindset feels like. So a divergent mindset, simply put, is where you are taking one singular thing and out of that one singular thing, generating multiple things. So what does that mean? It simply means that if you have one problem, you could potentially be identifying multiple solutions. If you have one challenge, right, different ways of tackling that, or you could just be free thinking and coming up with different things to do, right? So divergent thinking is something that, you know, can happen quasi-intentionally, where we do like brainstorming, right? And we can encourage sort of that divergent thought process. Or it's something that can happen while we're just sitting there bored on our couch and we're just thinking about 900 things or nothing. And our brain is kind of just exploring and connecting all of these different things. So what I want you to do right now to explore this divergent mindset is I want you to think of 15 things that you could use a screwdriver for that are not driving in screws. I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and I want you to think of 15 things. The goal here is 15, not the quality necessarily, but what are 15 things? And they could be small things, they could be big things. Don't overthink it, but I'm going to give you 2 minutes. I'm going to do it with you so I can go. What you'll probably find as you're playing with the divergent mindset is that you might tend to get stuck on a particular direction of thought, right? So even within the divergent mindset, you can start to converge on a particular type of thinking, right? So you might be sitting here and you're still thinking about a screwdriver as a tool, right? So you're thinking of what are the different ways I could use a screwdriver as a tool? Maybe the question is, or what other ways entirely could I think of using a screwdriver, right? So even within a divergent mode, it's still possible to be more or less convergent in how you're thinking about the various ideas. So are there ways you could use a screwdriver in food preparation? Are there ways you could use a screwdriver for art? Are there ways you could use a screwdriver as an improv tool? Are there ways you could use a screwdriver to, I don't know, to create another tool, right? Could you do something to the screwdriver itself that might allow you to use a screwdriver in a completely different way? All right, so that was 2 minutes. If you engaged with it, I'm sure it was very stressful. I hope it was a little bit fun. But I'm sure there was a point where each of you got stuck. And what happens is when you get stuck and you start trying to imply that intentionality to divergence, that's when you start to enter the executive control network, which makes divergent thought more difficult. So what you want to do is you want to try to relax again. You want to try to start daydreaming, right? That's why people come up with ideas when they're in the shower, when they're going on walks, is because when you're engaging in something and allowing your default mode network to work in the background, that's when your mind starts to connect different things and work in different ways. Convergence. Out of many comes to one, right? So maybe we have a ton of ideas and now we have to figure out which one's the best idea. Or maybe we have a ton of problems and we have to figure out which problem we're going to work on first. Or maybe we have a complex problem where we know that there's only one solution to this problem, but we have to use a different type of mental network or mode of thinking to land at the right solution. So on this slide, I have a little bit of a riddle. If you've seen this before, don't throw the answer too quickly. If you haven't seen this before, take some time. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to think through the riddle on here. So 2 girls were born on the same day, same month, same year, to the same parents, but they're not twins. How is this possible? You can probably start to see and even feel in your head that your brain is working a little bit differently than it was when you were asked to come up with a number of ideas, right? You know there's one answer to this. So already your brain is starting to kind of narrow in and focus on what could the solution to this be. There is only one solution to this. Well, I guess technically there could be multiple solutions if you want to get clever with it. But they're all basically in the same vein. So here's where you're tapping into your logical brain. You're tapping into analysis. You're tapping into problem solving, right? You're being very directed towards what the solution to this could be. You'll probably also feel yourself start editing your ideas. Whereas in the divergent stage, you were probably realizing that you were trying not to edit, or at least I hope you were trying not to edit the ideas that you were coming up with, right? Because your goal was to come up with as many ideas as possible. In the convergent stage, you immediately start editing. right? Because you know they're not twins. So immediately you're like, well, they're not twins. So I know that there's a right answer here. So what aren't they, right? And you're starting to edit the potential solutions. I'll come back to this when we get to the end and give you the answer if you don't know. Analogous lateral thinking is an odd combination of default and executive modes. You're still using your imagination, but you're using a different type of like problem solving here. So you're looking for similarities and differences. You're looking for ways to take something from one area and apply it to another area, right? If you're familiar with architecture, there's a famous example of an architect that took inspiration from like termite mounds, right, and used that to build a building that had more efficient air conditioning and air ventilation in it, based off of how termites build their mounds. So I want you to take a couple minutes. Again, there's not necessarily a right answer or a wrong answer here, but I want you to spend some time looking for similarities and finding similarities, anything, any similarity between a saw, like a handsaw, a horse, like you ride, the trampoline, you know, big, small, doesn't matter what size it is, and the season of summer. So these are intentionally very different things, but I want you to take a couple minutes. I want you to really try to find any similarity that you can possibly find. So again, I'll set a couple minutes starting now. So maybe you start making a list, maybe you start making columns, maybe you start sketching, maybe you start drawing things. Maybe you pick one and put it at the center and start seeing what the other things have in common with it, right? And maybe not all four of them have to have something in common. Maybe it's three, maybe it's two. Maybe sometimes the similarity is a scenario. Maybe it's attributes. But that's the goal when you're thinking of analogous or lateral kind of mental processes, mindsets, is that you are trying to explore any type of relationship between these objects. There's no right answer. There's not one thing that they have in common. So in that way, it's more of a divergent mode of thinking. But at the same time, it's a convergent mode of thinking in that you're trying to find similarities between multiple things down to one thing, right? So it's an interesting combination of kind of a divergent, convergent exercise where you're combining kind of the two modes of thought in one. And it's an interesting combination of kind of the default and executive modes of thinking. Okay, and finally, my personal favorite is the emergent mindset. So emergence is a phenomenon where at some point in the development of an object, of an organism, of a system, that the system becomes more than the sum of its parts. So if we were to look at a car, we can ask ourselves at what point, what screw do we put into the car that makes it a car? The answer is you can't identify one part of that car that makes it a car. It's the combination of all of the elements that make it a car. It's the same thing with a human, same thing with a tree. We can't go and say we're going to take out this one little part and then it's not going to be a human anymore, right? It's much more complicated than that. But the emergent mindset celebrates this idea that we can take any number of things at our disposal. We can create something more than those things. A lot of times when we think of convergent thinking, we think we have to find the right solution, but the answer might be maybe we combine multiple solutions, right? So there's any number of things combining different materials. We have alloys, right? We created entirely new materials. This emergent way of thinking allows for the combination of things that might be unique unto themselves that come together to create something, again, unique unto itself that is more than the sum of these parts, right? So you have this illustration of like the square, the triangle, the circle, and then you have the car on the right. And the reality is that just represents, well, there's basic shapes, but you can combine and put these shapes together in different ways that create so much more than just a square, a triangle, or a circle, but you take elements of each of those to create something more than that. So as a way to explore kind of this emergent mindset, I'm going to challenge you to spend 2 minutes using only the materials within arm's reach. And I'll give you a step in any direction, one step in any direction to grab something, but only the materials within arm's reach. So if you've got Post-its, rubber bands, whatever, to make a piece of jewelry. And I will let you define what the type of jewelry it is. It can be an earring, it can be glasses, it can be a hat, it can be a bracelet, whatever you define as jewelry. But the point here is to say, where in this process does it go from a bunch of stuff around me to that piece of jewelry? All right. So 2 minutes, go. Side note, this is also why I keep a lot of random materials on my desk, because you never know when somebody's going to ask you to grab a bunch of stuff in arm's reach and make something out of it. And something I want to note here too, as well, while you're kind of putting things together, is our lives are an emergent phenomenon. Every day we wake up, we make creative decisions about how we live our life, about what we're going to do at work, how we're going to get to work. We can get into a routine, but even so, each day that routine is a new instance of that routine, right? We're recreating every day, every moment. So as we go through our lives, as we go through our days, we have innumerable opportunities for creation. We have innumerable opportunities to design something, to make something that didn't exist moments before, right? The you that exists now did not exist this morning. The you that is sitting here thinking and working on these things, that heard these talks, you are different in some way, right? So we are all part of an emergent phenomenon we call culture, we call society, right? We call countries. We are ourselves emergent phenomenons, and our work that we do every day is an emergent phenomenon. Last but not least, frameworks. So I think we might have covered at least 2 out of 3 of these. I know we definitely didn't cover the universal traveler, but I love the universal traveler model, and we'll get there for a second. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the double diamond model or double diamond framework, the IDEO framework, and then the universal traveler. And you will see how even within these frameworks, they're pulling together the different mindsets as well as the different modes of thought and neural processes to create a structured creative process. So we'll start with the double diamond. Double diamond starts with a challenge, has what's called a flare or a divergent phase of discovery, where you are exploring the challenge space, right? It is intentionally a divergent mode of thought. You are trying to discover, uncover, unpack, collect as much information as you can around the challenge space. Then you see it starts to focus back in. You have a convergent mode in the creative process that brings you down to the problem definition, right? So once you've uncovered all of this stuff, there's synthesis that goes into this. You're combining all of these things to land on an area where you want to focus your attention in terms of the solution that you are generating. Then it goes back into a divergent mode of thought where you're generating solutions. Then it goes back into a convergent mode of thought where you are narrowing down those potential solutions. And then finally, you get to an outcome. And I know, Nora, you just released an article about do we need a triple diamond or a quintuple diamond? But the point here is that it's this iteration of divergent and convergent thought that really allows for this kind of creative conversation to happen. And you can scale this. You can do this on your own. Again, like Amy was saying, you know, who do I want to be today? How do I want to kind of live my life and run these kind of creative experiments? You can do this as a team on a product design. You can do this at any scale. And then there's the IDEO framework. So slightly different than the convergent divergent mode of thought, although if you look up IDEO's updated creative model, they too have started taking this kind of divergent convergent mode of thinking. But their original kind of framework, this very famous 5 hexagon kind of thing, empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. What's great about this framework is that it's directional. It gives you a place to start. It gives you an objective. Then it gives you a step. Then it gives you another step. And then it tells you kind of how to keep moving forward. So you're empathizing, right, with somebody, with your users, ideally. That whole concept of human-centered design is empathizing with other people. We've expanded that now, community-centered design, nature-centered design. You know, there's a ton of things that you can empathize with. And, you know, I think being aware of where we sit in the design process and who we're choosing to empathize with and why and how that's going to influence our design process down the road. You can also continue empathy throughout the process, but we'll get into that. Right. So you see empathize, again, a divergent mode of thinking. You're trying to empathize with as many people as possible, get as much information, trying to define what that problem looks like. Again, ideate, go back to that divergent. Prototype, there's a step in between ideation and prototyping where you have to select the idea that you want to prototype. So within ideation, there's a divergent and convergent. And within prototype, there's a divergent and convergent. So you might have multiple prototypes of a single idea that you then test to narrow down or refine. And that prototype is really where you're starting to get into that emergent mode of thought, right? Even in ideation, you're starting to get into that emergent mode of thought where it's, okay, how can we combine different ideas to create something? How can we combine different materials? How can we improvise different things so that we can get a rough prototype so that people can start interacting with these things? And then testing, again, that's a very kind of convergent mode of thought. You want to understand how this thing is working. There's a very logical approach to it, very structured approach to it, very analytical approach to it. I know it's really small up in the right-hand corner, but if you Google IDEO design thinking, you'll see something that looks more like the kind of wavy double diamond or triple diamond that IDEO is now kind of playing with this implementation, inspiration, ideation, and then implementation framework, which I think is really nice. That finally leads me to my personal favorite, Universal Traveler. If you haven't heard of this book, if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. It is just a fantastic framework for thinking about life. Yes, it's great if you're trying to design something, but in reality, we're all designing our lives. Also a great book, Design Your Life. Check it out. But this framework is really great. And what's great about this is, look, they label convergent thinking, divergent thinking, convergent thinking. So again, you're starting to see that the creative process is really this mode of default mode network and then executive mode network, and alternating between these two things so that you're kind of narrowing into what problem you're solving and then how you're solving that problem. So what I like about the Universal Traveler framework is it starts with this idea of acceptance. Accept who you are, accept where you are, accept what your limitations are, accept what the nature of the problem is, accept the impact that you can have on that problem, and accept that this is the problem that you want to do. Then once you've accepted that, you can start to analyze it, right? You can start to look at it, break it apart, look at it in different ways, different perspectives. Then you can, again, redefine what the problem is based on the perspective, based on how you're engaging with it. And again, with ideation, and what I like, again, about Universal Traveler is they break up that little mix between ideation and prototype with this idea. Wow, have you ever said a word too many times? You forget how to say it. Idea selection and that convergent thinking, and then implementation, which they get very broad about implementation. They talk about prototyping. So again, kind of mixing all of these kind of frameworks together to get you kind of in a good place. And then evaluation, that convergent thinking. How did it work? I like the universal traveler framework because I have found it actually translates very well into the emergency medicine world. And it's something that I think about every day in terms of how I approach a patient, how I approach what the patient issues might be. I'm accepting that this is the situation. There's not much I can do to change the patient's condition. I'm analyzing what symptoms are they presenting with. I'm trying to define based on their patient history, based on what they're presenting with, based on what they're doing recently, where they are, what I think the problems might be. I'm ideating. What do I need to do? Do I need to transport them? Do I need to treat them? Am I giving them medication? And then I'm picking a thing to go for. I'm doing something. We're seeing how it works. And then ultimately, we're continuing to monitor them as we go. So it's really fascinating to see kind of how the creative process is not something that's limited just to designers or artists, but is in fact something that kind of transcends any particular trade or craft, and is something that I think hopefully you will see now is innate in our nature as human beings, and something that all of you can begin practicing today. Yeah, so I don't know if I breezed through that. I completely lost track of time, Nora, so I hope we're still good on time. Yeah.
We're great. That was awesome. So if you have questions for Andrew, why don't you put them in the Q&A? We do have a couple already, so we'll jump into those. Andrew, if there was one skill to practice to get better at being creative, what would it be?
I should have an answer to this one. I think if there was one skill that I would practice, it would be the skill of jumping in. I think there was a podcast that I listened to, Creative Spark, I think is what it's called, or Spark Podcast. It's a great podcast. But there was an author on it, and she had a mantra at the beginning of every creative project that was stop worrying, start working. And I think if there's anything that I have tried to embody, I think it goes to like, don't be afraid of failure, right? It goes to the idea of just like iteration, right? Like the best way to start moving forward on something is starting to move forward on something.
Yeah, that's a good skill. Jump in. We do have one question also about the slides. Was skewing the slides an intentional behavioral tactic to get people to be more creative?
Yes. The whole, so I don't know if it shows up well on the Zoom thing, but I knew that in Zoom as well, it gives you the black bars kind of around the thing. And so I tried to expand the black to give you like a weird not square shape. And then I tilted everything as well so that, we're starting to think about things in different ways. I don't know if it was much a behavioral tactic as maybe just a way for me to be like, hey, I'm creative. But, emergent phenomenon, unintentional, unintended consequences, maybe. So.
Absolutely. All right, we have time for one more. In business contexts, this person increasingly sees creativity as deeply connected to risk. Any thoughts on how people solving business problems need to accept levels of risk in order to get more creative solutions?
Yeah, I think it's all about risk tolerance. I think if you try to do something outside of the tolerance of risk in an organization, then it's going to backfire tenfold. My experience has always been the risk has to be not just proportional to the reward, but proportional to the perceived damage that somebody's reputation might take in the company if something doesn't work. So you have to understand, yes, one person's tolerance of risk might be, let's throw $1 million at it. And if we lose $1 million, fine. But what did we learn? Other people might be, I'm going to give you $100. And if this doesn't work, then that's a failure. So you have to understand what the tolerance is for you in terms of where's my wiggle room on, do I have to nail this or do I have room to play with this? So it's a navigational thing. I think it's a way you have to understand who your stakeholders are. You have to understand um, what the buffer is in terms of, hey, if we invest, $100,000 into this and it doesn't work, are we going to be okay? Or do we have to modify our plan to say, well, maybe it's $20,000 we can risk on this, and what can we really do with $20,000? Um, and to me, that's part of the creative process, right? There's a feedback loop between the solution and the challenge that you have to be aware of, and you can't be so focused on just driving the solution home that you're ignoring the feedback that you're getting from the challenge space. So I hope that answers the question. That's been my experience. I'm sure other people will have different answers, but that's me.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Andrew.
Yeah, of course.